What do you think of the approach?
Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, that U.S. and China will have same goals but different approach. Americans tend to use serious sanctions, and they trust sanctions work. But historically speaking, it seems that sometimes sanctions work, but some other times sanctions always failed. So China, we think we need both sanctions and negotiations. And the sanctions should be just polishing sanction rather than just fatal sanctions, because we and China and the States will have a different goals. We think denuclearization should be balanced with peace and stability, but it seems that American put the denuclearization the first priority than everything else, peace and stability. But given Chinese relations with DPRK and geopolitical consideration, we're bound to balance between peace, stability, and denuclearization. So that's why we think sanction is okay, but first of all, should be under the UN platform, and secondly, should be just polishing rather than fatal sanction.
But what do you mean by fatal sanctions, sir? Before we have our American guest participating, I think the audio is now being fixed at the moment. So is it, for example, as the U.S. proposed, include the banning of DPRK planes to China, for example, including banning of oil exports from China to DPRK through some of the small pipelines from China. DPRK totally depends on that when it comes to fuel. And also, the U.S. was also proposing earlier about banning any kind of international banking interactions with DPRK. For example, those in Macau, as was the case many years ago. What do you make of these suggestions? Are they workable?
It seems that Americans think it's workable, but facts show that it doesn't work. That's why we see the third and the fourth trial of the nuclear task by DPRK. So this time, American proposal is that cut off the oil export and banning air flight to Beijing, from Pyongyang to Beijing, and banking sanctions. So all those, for me to see, is fatal sanctions. Think about that. No flight from Pyongyang to Beijing. No oil from Beijing to Pyongyang. So Pyongyang will feel highly isolated. So if one country feels highly isolated, what should they do? I think it will go even further. So different countries have different approach. We can see the South Korea, they think they want to have 5-party talks, the 6-party talks without DPRK, but American want fatal sanctions, and China still want to resumption of 6-party talks. So different countries have different approaches. The Chinese way is that we need really negotiation among different countries, find a common interest and a common approach.
And now I'm told that Mr. Paal can get through to us now. And Mr. Paal, what do you make of the different approaches? The U.S. believes in sanctions. You probably have also heard earlier from Mr. Yuan Peng the argument from the Chinese side why sanctions is not the end game, but rather negotiations should be.
Well, I'm sorry to say I couldn't hear Mr. Yuan the last couple of minutes. But on the question of sanctions, I'm not a big believer in sanctions myself. However, we've been through a very extended diplomatic process with North Korea. The Obama administration, by my count, has reached out 5 times diplomatically to North Korea and seen its hand slapped back by the North Korean leadership 5 times. So there's a sense that the North is not getting the message. They need to be reminded that they're part of the international system and they have responsibilities to it. And the obvious source of influence on North Korea is China, which provides vital supplies of commodities and domestic consumption items, and and critical industrial items as well. And China has been very carefully limiting the scope of the sanctions, which have been authorized by the UN Security Council, using its position as a member of the Permanent Five to limit that. In frustration, the U.S. has turned to stronger self-defense measures, some of which China does not like, and there's now talk of expanding the theater high-altitude air defense system in Korea. The previous nuclear test, the third nuclear test by North Korea, led the U.S. to deploy anti-ballistic missile silos in 13 additional ones in Alaska and California to provide protection against the growing missile and nuclear threat from North Korea. And the U.S. will continue along this line. We're hoping to motivate China to do more to persuade North Korea. Now, it's not all sanctions. Remember back in 2010, there were a lot of tensions between North Korea and South Korea and with the international community. And at the end of 2010, the Chinese government took a diplomatic initiative with North Korea that brought us a considerable period of reduced tension. When Mr. Dai Bingguo traveled to North Korea in late 2010. I wouldn't rule out that kind of diplomacy making a difference too. I think we can, working together, we ought to be able to find the right combination of carrot and sticks to deal with North Korea.
Mr. Yuan, do you buy what Mr. Paal just mentioned, that it has to be a combination of both carrots and sticks?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's the balanced way. So sanction per se doesn't work, and the fatal sanction, will deemed to be failed in the last minute. And somebody want to make some comparison between North Korean sanction to Iranian sanction, but the case is totally different.
Why is that?
The Iran so far hasn't made any single nuclear test. The DPRK boasted that they have already been a nuclear country, so it's much harder for a nuclear country to give up existing power and existing achievement. So in this regard, I think we need to be more patient. We need to be more coordinated and be more foreign policy oriented negotiation.
What else can the United States do, Mr. Paal, in order to ease the tension on the Korean Peninsula and even to work with the Chinese side?
Well, I think there's plenty of room. We've talked about getting the 5 members of the 6-party talks together, excluding North Korea for a while, to see if we can't improve our diplomacy and the kinds of offers we make to North Korea to try to test their very unlikely willingness to limit or reduce their or eliminate their nuclear capabilities. The path forward for a while appeared to be that between South Korea and North Korea. We had the August agreement on reducing tensions after the North Korean provocation along the DMZ earlier in the year. And that seemed to lead us in a new direction. But not, and all of us, I think, at the end of 2015 felt that there was some movement toward a reduction in tensions on the peninsula. And yet the North, out of the blue, came up with this so-called H-bomb test, and I think undermined the premises of Beijing and Seoul and Washington that we had someone to work with. We now need to regroup, pull ourselves together, and see if we can find a combination of diplomatic initiatives and countermeasures that will give North Korea more reason to see that the calculus of continuing to develop the weapons is not going to lead them to a better place.
Is what Mr. Paal suggested as the diplomatic initiatives, for example, the 5-party talks, for example, the DPRK and ROK talks, or some kinds of negotiations, possible as China considers this?
No matter 5-party talks, 6-party talks, the key of those talks is U.S. and China cooperation. The past success of the story is based on U.S. and China cooperation. But today, the tragedy is that U.S. and China in quarrel, in disputes in many areas, in South China Sea, East China Sea, in American traditional allies, and in Chinese foreign policy. So I think DPRK is using the big power disputes to achieve its selfish goal. So today it's time for the United States to think about its rebalancing to Asia. What's the goal for that? Is to hedging against China or cooperate with China to maintain the peace and the stability of the region. So I think that the recent DPRK, the 4th try, gave us an alert that it's time for U.S. and China to rebalance to the past good timing of the cooperation.
But Mr. Yuan, some would argue this is a chicken and egg thing, isn't it? I mean, a DPRK issue could be one of the areas that the United States and China can work together and cooperate on, and therefore bringing better atmosphere to the other issues between the two countries. Or it could be the other way around. You wait until everything gets better before we go and work on the DPRK issue, which is quite a crucial issue. So many would say this is a chicken and egg thing. You cannot just say, let's make everything else better so that we can work on this.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a chicken and egg story. But first of all, I think we have some cooperation so far, even if we have some disputes on the approach. But at least we have a dialogue between US and China. We both agree to have some kind of a sanction under the UN Security Council, And the problem is that given today the distrust between US and China, given today the six-party talks, at least three of them, US, China, and Japan, has some disputes.
Right.
It's very hard to find some consensus and coordination in dealing with the same, hot spot. So I mean, on the one hand, we need cooperation in dealing with the urgent DPRK nuclear issue. On the other hand, it's alert to us that we need to resumption of the cooperation among the big powers.
But on the other hand, there is something that is quite urgent. For example, there has been media reports suggesting that the DPRK might be in the near future testing a missile launch in the future. Of course, the Chinese Foreign Ministry have already responded to this, expressed concern about this. Nobody knows what time, under what circumstances, what kind of test, and whether this kind of news is exact or only speculative. However, this is a big concern. So I'm sure at times all of this debate will come back once again. If we don't have a solution now, we're going to do the same stuff once and again in the near future. Mr. Paal.
Well, the missile test is like ham and eggs for breakfast. It goes with the nuclear test. The nuclear test is designed to make a smaller warhead that will fit on a missile and then find a more reliable missile. They've been making steady progress. Some of it's been fake. The submarine launched missile show that was put on a month ago, we can pretty much say was a fake now. But some of these capabilities are real, and the U.S., as I said earlier, has, after the third nuclear test, introduced more ABM launchers, and I expect we will do more of the same. Again, China didn't like that, but the U.S. president is not going to tell his people that we're going to make ourselves more vulnerable in the hope that North Korea will move to a better path. We have to do something to try to incentivize North Korea to realize that it's going down a path that will not buy them the security they think it will.